And the next stage of life where children are putting their feet on the earth is what we call the fast life. And if anybody knows about being around a 2-year-old to a 7-year-old, we know that child is very busy. And they're busy exploring their world. And that's the time where children find out where their footprints can go within the family context, within the village context. They don't wander too far from home at that point. And they work in a way where they feel that their feet are on the earth. And so those moccasins that were made for children, that come from that sacred animal we call the four-legged, the deer, the buffalo, the bison, the moose, the elk, the caribou. Those in our territory in Manitoba here, those animals always provided those things for us. And so those moccasins that were given to a child, those wraps we call them, they were there to show the child that their footprint was important. And through the hide of the moccasin, the child could actually see their footprint on the earth. All of us throughout life can see our footprint on the earth. Our footprint becomes embedded in the moccasin that we wear. And so the moccasin is a tool to help us understand that caring and sharing that those four-leggeds provide us is also something that is a law. It's a law that we must practice on the earth. And when they see their footprint in that moccasin, those moccasins aren't worn by anyone else. They're only worn by that child. Those baby wraps that are made for them, we don't wait to put that moccasin on them. There's a baby wrap that's done. There's when they become that fast life, they live in that fast life where they're exploring where their feet can go, where their footprint can go. They're learning about things. They're learning about things in the teepee. They're learning about things in the circle of the family, so that they don't go too far, because their growth and development during this time is very fast. So it's not that the child is moving fast. However, 2-year-olds can do that. 4-year-olds can do that. They can do something before you can stop them, because they're very quick. They're very quick during that stage of development. But it means that their metabolism, their growth and development is also fast. And it's part of why in mainstream society today they say that what you're going to give a child from birth to 7 years is what they will carry for the rest of their lives. In our tradition and our belief, we always knew that. We always understood that. So the most critical life stages for a child's development in the way in which we see this feather teaching is that good life and that fast life. That good life prepares them for having seen all the things that people do, the hard work that people do, the ceremonies that people do, the way in which they're in relationship to each other, the manner in which they keep their place that they live in, the manner in which the cooking is done, the manner in which the teachings are shared, the ceremonies. Children are not kept from very many ceremonies whatsoever, because it's believed that these are part of life and living. And so in being able to see certain things, that a child will see them as natural, from someone being born to someone leaving the earth. At one time it was seen as being natural. The only time a child might be kept or prevented from a ceremony is if there's a harsh negativity that might be dealt with. And back in previous times, those times would be few and far between. They would not be involved in those kinds of ceremonies. However, in today's ceremonial life, it's a little bit different because we have many things as a people to overcome, having had a relationship with harshness over the last 400 to 500 years. So in today's world, we would not take children to ceremonies. In the world that we had prior to contact, there would be very few occasions where a child would be prevented from participating. It was also understood that the innocence of that child always needed to be protected. So there were certain traditions that the old people would do, and very often a child in a ceremony would just go to sleep, especially if they were in that infant or fast life stage. They would go to sleep to the songs. Of course, that there were older people's things that they would be involved in that a child wouldn't be involved in. For example, an infant in the good life and in the fast life would not hear the legends as told by old people to old people. They would hear the legends as told to them in the child's form. So there was a story that would be told at an infant toddler stage. The same story might be told by old people to each other, and it would take on a very different life, a very different connotation. It would be the same story, but the story would be graduated in terms of depth and in terms of understanding according to the 7 stages of life. So stories, ceremonies, songs were always important all the way through all of these stages of life. In this fast life, the child that struggled here through the mother's birth canal, the infant, the newborn that struggled through the mother's birth canal, also now has a different kind of physical struggle in that this family surrounds them and allows them that extended parameter. So it's no longer the birth canal that's the wall. What it is the family that becomes that wall of nurturance. And so that if this child is going to run off over here, they bump up against the family. And the family turns them around and sends them back to the center of that family again. And if you contemplate life in a teepee, where there's a fire inside, how you manage the rearing of a child during the winter months requires and calls for common sense that says that everyone who is in that structure will look after this child. Will look after this child in that they're going to teach them right from the beginning what happens if you go too close there. Right? That you don't play with fire, that you don't play with things that are going to hurt you and harm you. You don't involve yourself. And in the opposite way, then they put good things into that fire. They don't make that fire so high that it's going to tumble down the teepee and catch the cover on fire. And so that child in that fast life is already learning preventative ways of being on the earth, that the cautions are natural cautions. They're everyday life and living cautions. And so that in that fast life, where they're developing their physical being, that family parameter is very important. And as a child gets a little bit older and is going to begin to move beyond that fast life, it's an extension then of that wall. They go outside of that family now. They're moving outside of that family, and they're going into that wandering life. And very often in that time, there are things that are done for young men, and there are things that are done for young women. And the women, the old women, the middle-aged women, the younger women would gather. And a very significant time for young ladies is when they get their first moon. Mm-hmm. In our way of looking at the world, the wandering life transitions them from being a child to being an adult. In our way, there is no adolescent, which is different from the Western perspective. They have an adolescent life in the Western perspective. We move from being a child into an adult, a young adult. And so that girl, her name that she was given as a child, after that time where she gets her moon, she'll do certain things that are preparatory for moving into that womanhood. And so the 4 seasons after she has her moon are very, very critical. In some traditions, and in our tradition, what we do in our family is that young woman will go on her berry fast after she has her first moon. And throughout that berry fast, her aunties, her grannies, her surrogate mothers, we didn't have those titles. Everybody older than her could be called granny or mother in the village. They will help her understand what it means now for those 4 seasons where she gives up all the fruit, all the berries that there are. She will not touch them, she will not eat them. And in that 4 seasons, she begins to understand what it means to be that person who in fact carries that fruit, who is that vessel of that fruit of human life through those berries that she is giving up. And so during that time, she is taught how to care for herself. She is taught how to look after herself. And the very first time she has her moon, all of those women gather and tell her what she's going to go through. Give her gifts. Tell her that it's a good medicine that she now has. That menses, that people call it in this outer world here in society. That menstrual cycle that she's been giving now is her cleaning time. And so right from the beginning of that cleaning time, it's never perceived as anything dirty or anything miserable or anything evil. It's seen from a place of strength. And it's the women who teach her how to manage herself during that time, how to care for herself during that time. And on the other side of that, for the boys, they also have ceremonies that are done for them. It's also when they're in that wandering life where they're moving beyond the family now more into the village, that the young men are put out to sit on the earth. They're put out to do their first fast, their first questing of vision, the first questing of their sightedness, so that they can be aspiring to be an older, better person, and that the time that they're going through in their wandering life is going to be good, and that they are going to find the teachers that will help them be the best men that they can be on the earth. And so in that wandering time, for both the males and the females, there again are ceremonies and songs and gifts that are understood, that are necessary to prepare. That young woman and that young man will now receive their adult name. And when they receive that adult name, it is only the mothers and the grandmothers who can speak that child name to them. And the reason for that, as I understand it, is that child name is the one that pulls it back to this good life, so they never forget where they come from. And the reason that it's the mother and the grandmother who can call that name to them is because the women are the first teachers of the children. And so inside that teepee, inside that womb, inside that tikanagan, those are the first teachers. That's the first sound that the child will always hear. And it's the woman who sounds that name to them first, at their childhood name. And so when they hear that childhood name being called after they've become a young adult, they know that they have to listen to something. They know that they're being called on something when they hear that name being sounded out. It's also that name can be called to help them when they're in a time of need, to take them back to that good life and that fast life where they had all that nurturance and all that unconditional love. So it is why the women are the ones that can sound that name freely after they have arrived in that wandering life. When they receive that adult name now will tell them and dictate to them Creator's intention, because that name doesn't come from a human being. None of our names come from a human being. The people who bring the names here to the children are the vessels of Creator's intention. And so when that name comes, it's a guide, it's your parameters, it's your spiritual parameters, it's your spiritual wall, if you will, that tells you how far you can go inside life. And so when you're in that wandering life, that's why it's very important during those 4 seasons, during that fasting time, to receive that name. So upon that womanhood and that manhood, that they'll quickly be able to begin working on how to understand that name in their life. And so namings are very important to us because they help us understand the laws that we've been given. And the name that I carry will not be necessarily the name that you carry, but if we carry a similar or the same name, then we know we have a similar path and a similar journey to make, and so that we can become friends and helpers to each other in that, and in that way we're relatives. Even though that blood may not be there, we are related. The other way in which a child in the wandering life, in particular, will be instructed is to the clan or the kinship, the family, the relative that we most resemble in the animal world, in the spirit world, will become very important to the child's learning in that wandering life, where they're moving beyond, because then they will be beyond that teepee, they will be beyond that home structure. And so prior to that, all they will really have seen is, in terms of their kinship, would be their parent and their grandparent kinships. But there's a lot more kinship out there. And so it's very important during this wandering life that the children or the youth learn that law, that we are never to become intimately related to our clan brothers and sisters, that in the union that we make, that is of a man and a woman type, the sexual relation or the intimate relation, we would begin to understand that we don't marry our relatives. And so therefore, always we understood that incest was not a part of our life. Marrying our relatives was against the law. And that the touching of brothers and sisters had to do with being very mindful of that law. And so there were some societies that were so strict that when a brother and a sister entered the room together, they sat with their backs to each other. They did not look upon each other. When a child was to have a ceremony, if it was a female child, it would be the females who would look after that ceremony. If a male was to have a ceremony, it would be the males to look after the ceremony. Each seeking help and support from the other, male and female. But we had really, really strict laws of relation, very strict laws of relation. And the most strict law that emulated that was about that the fact that we didn't intermarry within our own kinship. So, for example, as a Musqua, as a bear, I would not marry another bear, even if that bear was a different kind. It's just not done. It's against the law to do that. Those were not laws that were made by human beings. Those were laws that were made by time and through Creator's eyes. And so when the child learned that the youth, the young woman and the young man, they began having differentiated learning now. Mm-hmm. Up to that point, when that ceremony, when that vision questing ceremony, they were seen as a neutral being, that they could be involved in any teachings. They were not perceived as a male-female child until that ceremony happened, where they were vision questing for the young woman and for the young man to see their adult life. Now they were instructed very different. And it was also at this time that I understand where betrothals, where the adult world could begin to understand who they were to marry. Maybe an old person would have a dream, or that young person would have a dream. I had a granny tell me that romance is a European structure. Mm-hmm. Romance is not something that was part of pre-married life. Romance did not happen amongst our people in that manner. And she was very descriptive in that she said there wasn't this big open field where two people were on either side of the field and they ran in slow motion like in the movies, and they embraced each other and they decided that they were going to get married. That's not how it was for our people. She told me that romance happens after you're married. If there is such a thing as romance, she said, it happens after you're married. That's when you fall in love. That's when love becomes an unconditional state of being, when you can accept your partner's faults and weaknesses, strengths, and the things that they need to work upon. And so one must also understand in today's context, there has been so much interference in the relationships between males and females that back then it was very clearly understood the instruction that was given since that child was born. So when we look at it from today's context and we look back, we can say all kinds of things, but we must remember that it was a much simpler life back then, that from birth we were guided in these ways. We didn't have all these things that pull us in different directions. We didn't have intercultural, international depths to consider. We had our villages, and our villages were finite. And the most people that we would see is when we went to the next territory for a gathering of the people. And there it wouldn't even be considered to be international, because there might be 2 or 3 other families. So we have to remember that the context that I'm giving these teachings in was in a much simpler life. Mm-hmm. And so that time now where that young person has either been betrothed, or they're getting an understanding that this is a person that they're gonna marry. They're prior to that marriage being confirmed, they are instructed for 4 seasons in the married life. And so the women will take the young woman who's going to be married, and the men will take the young man who's going to be married, and instruct them what it means to be in that married life. And so that it was at a time when it was much simpler, that when a vow was made between 2 people, it was much easier to understand the sacredness of that vow. And that the way in which we have come to understand sexual interactions is far and above those laws of that vow that was taken in the married life. It was much simpler then. And so that vow that was made in the married life wouldn't have all kinds of distractions. So that divorce, separation, those things were not contemplated as options, because the whole village was there to help that couple be the best couple that they could be, for the vessels that they would become in bringing the children, the grandchildren, to the earth.